For 164 minus 70, I tend to like adding and subtracting things that end in zeros. That tends to be easier for me. So the way that I think of this is, well, let me just go ahead, even though typically we wouldn't round that up, since I would really like to subtract 70 from that, I would go ahead and say that that's close to 170. So I would say, okay, let's do 170 minus 70, and then I'll worry about the fact that it wasn't quite 170. So really what I'm doing is I'm saying 164 is 170 minus 6, right? Or it's 6 more, or I'm sorry, 6 less than 170. And then remember that I'm subtracting 70. So 170 minus 70, if I use the commutative property, that's easy to do in my head. That's just 100. And then I would say, oh, well, I didn't really have 170 to start with. I only had 164. So I actually ended up subtracting from a number that was 6 higher than what it should have been, right? So then I need to subtract that off in the end. So 100 minus 6 gives me 94. Again, I'm doing this mentally, like this is the process I'm showing, but the idea is just say, well, 164 is close to 170, so let's do 170 minus 70, which is 100, but it wasn't supposed to be as big as 170. It was only supposed to be as big as 164. So I need to subtract off that extra 6 that I added in the beginning. So another way you could write that same process is just to say, okay, 164 plus 6 would give me 170, right? And so really I can think of it that way, right? As 170 is 164 plus 6. But if I'm gonna add 6 to it, then I'd also subtract 6 at the same time. So we can think of this as 164 is really 170 164, add 6 to that, and then also subtract 6. So it's kind of a weird way to write it, but you could do it that way. So this is just keeping track of, I really want to get 170 because 170 is easier to do, but then I'm going to have to remember that if I'm just going to add 6 to this, I'm going to have to subtract it later, right? So I'm just going to go ahead and do it now. And then I just changed the order that all of this is in. I'm going to say, okay, let's go ahead and do this part. 164 plus 6 is 170. And then let's go ahead and use the commutative property and subtract that. So 170 minus 70 is 100. And then that minus 6 comes into play finally. So there's lots of ways you could show that same process. This one did not come as natural to me, but another idea would be to go ahead and instead of using 70, use 64 because that's easier, right? So it's a little tougher, I think, to keep track of, but it still works, right? So if I were to do 164 minus 64, that would give me 100, right? But then I only subtracted 64 and I was supposed to subtract 70, right? So I was supposed to subtract 6 more than I did, right? So that means that I would still need to subtract another 6 from that 100.